Today on Brief History, we take a look at an English king whose rise to power would be most unexpected. From his life abroad as an exile, he would overcome all odds to push his claims to the throne, dawning a new dynasty in England. But his time as king would be a troubled and anxious experience, for there were many who saw fit to champion the claims of others against him. Join me as I take a brief look at Henry Tudor, remembered today as Henry VII of England. Henry was born on January 28, 1457 at Pembroke Castle in Wales. His father was a man named Edmund Tudor, and his mother was Margaret Beaufort. Before discussing Henry's early life, it is important to briefly discuss Henry's lineage through both his father and his mother, and some of the political events that were taking place around this time. Henry's father, Edmund Tudor, was the son of Catherine of Valois, Henry's grandmother, who was the daughter of a French king. She had previously been married to Henry V of England, the famous English king remembered for his accomplishments during the war between England and France known as the 100 Years' War. King Henry V died young and unexpectedly, and with that his son Henry VI of England became king. However, Henry V had in his service during his lifetime a Welshman named Owen Tudor, who after Henry V's death carried on an affair with Henry's widowed grandmother, Catherine of Valois. There is much mystery surrounding the relationship between Henry's grandmother and Henry's grandfather, but it is believed that they were eventually married and produced two sons, Jasper, Henry's uncle, and Henry's father, Edmund. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, on the other hand, was a descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt was the father of the first Lancastrian king, Henry IV, and the grandfather of the second Lancastrian king, Henry V, just previously touched on. John of Gaunt had illegitimate children known as the Beauforts, which were legitimized during a previous reign, and this legitimized line is where Henry's mother derives her royal connections, as John of Gaunt was one of the sons of Edward III. Henry's birth took place under difficult circumstances. His father was the half-brother of King Henry VI, the king at the time of Henry's birth, and had been made Earl of Richmond. However, Henry's father had died of the plague in 1456 at 26 years of age. Despite this, Henry's mother, only 13 years old at the time, had already become pregnant with Henry at the time of his father's death. It is believed that she suffered a difficult birth, as one could imagine, and that perhaps significant damage was done to the young girl, as Henry was to be her only child, despite remarrying twice again, something that will be touched on shortly. The political events taking place at the time of Henry's birth were dangerous ones and are infamously remembered today as the Wars of the Roses. In short, the Wars of the Roses were a battle initially for control of the Lancastrian feeble-minded king Henry VI, but eventually the disputes morphed into a battle for the throne itself. The battles were fought between the House of Lancaster, from where Henry derived his royal connections, and the House of York. The Lancastrians would eventually be decimated, with King Henry VI being deposed and the first Yorkist king Edward IV seizing power, something that will be touched on again shortly. Although Henry, through his grandfather Owen Tudor, had Welsh ancestry, it has been argued that Henry's connection to Wales is often over-exaggerated and that he spent little time there and did not speak Welsh himself. In 1461, the eventual first Yorkist king Edward IV began winning crucial battles, specifically the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, which saw Henry's grandfather Owen Tudor executed and his uncle Jasper put to flight, and the decisive Battle of Towton, which saw massive Lancastrian losses. With the regime change, 5-year-old Henry came under the care of a Yorkist supporter named William Herbert. But Henry's time under Lord Herbert was to be short-lived, as soon the Lancastrians, backed by disaffected allies of Edward IV, regained control of the throne, with Edward IV eventually fleeing into exile on the continent. Lord Herbert was killed at the Battle of Edgecote, and after Henry VI had been restored to the throne, it has been said that Henry's uncle Jasper, back from exile, took Henry to London, where he had an encounter with his half-uncle, King Henry VI. But unfortunately, the Lancastrians' time back in power was also to be short-lived, as soon Edward IV and his Yorkist supporters attempted again to seize control. They were successful, and this time the Lancastrians were defeated for good, with Edward IV retaking the throne, defeating his disaffected allies, and having King Henry VI executed in the Tower of London. With this, the 14-year-old Henry and his uncle Jasper fled to the continent. It is believed that they initially wished to travel to France, but adverse winds landed them in Brittany. Although Henry would style himself as the Earl of Richmond while in exile, a title in which his father held, in reality, under Yorkists, this honor was bestowed elsewhere. On the continent, Henry would be at the mercy of others, but it was here in Brittany that Henry's life would begin to change dramatically. Upon landing in Brittany, Henry and his uncle were received by the Duke of Brittany, Francis II. Although Henry's claims to the throne were undoubtedly weak, the near extinction of the Lancastrian line made his existence an annoyance to Edward IV and the Yorkist regime in England. The Yorkists wished to get their hands on Henry, and this soon became apparent. Duke Francis intended to keep Henry and his uncle as bargaining chips, but over the course of their 13 years in exile, a few interesting events would take place. Edward IV initially offered great rewards for delivering Henry to him, to which Duke Francis refused, but did take steps to make sure that Henry and his uncle Jasper could not be a threat to Edward IV. Henry and Jasper were separated, and their English servants were replaced by Breton servants in order that the two would be kept more closely guarded and monitored. Eventually, it is believed that Edward IV did convince Duke Francis that all he intended to do was marry off Henry to one of his daughters and finally settle the Lancastrian-Yorkist dispute. Therefore, Henry was sent to Saint-Malo to be transferred back to the Yorkist hands. Henry, realizing that his life was at stake, feigned sickness, and Duke Francis was brought around to the fact that Henry was likely being sent to his death, and therefore sent his treasurer, a man named Peter Landois, to distract the ambassadors while Henry was moved to sanctuary, thus forcing Edward IV's men to return empty-handed. This was a close call for Henry, but it would not be the last. In 1483, major events took place in England that would change the trajectory of Henry's life, and indeed England forever. Edward IV died in April 1483 at 40 years of age, and with that, his 12-year-old son became king. This young son of Edward IV is remembered today as King Edward V, but unfortunate events would unfold that would prevent him from being crowned. On young Edward V's travels to London, he was intercepted by his uncle, a man who at the time was the Duke of Gloucester and a major power in the north of England. In a very short span of time, this man, Edward IV's younger brother, would be designated as protector of the new young king and gain control of the situation. Soon he initiated a coup, which in the end would lead to him seizing the throne from his young nephew. This man's name was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, but today he is known as the controversial King Richard III of England. Richard would usurp his nephew's throne, and within a matter of a few months, the young and deposed King Edward V, along with his younger brother, Richard, would disappear, never to be seen again. These young boys would become infamously known today as the Princes in the Tower. It was rumored that Richard III had his nephews killed to prevent any future opposition in their name, although what exactly happened to the boys was not known at the time, and indeed there are still many questions that remain unanswered about this topic to this day. The events that had unfolded in England, with Richard III usurping the throne and allegedly having his nephews killed, increased Henry's stock tremendously, as prior to this time, he was seen as a rather obscure individual with a weak claim to the throne. Henry, reunited with his uncle Jasper and attendants after Edward IV's death, soon became a frontrunner of opposition to the unpopular Richard III. Around that time, that rumors began to spread of the Princes in the Tower's disappearance. One of Richard III's closest allies, a man named Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, became opposed to Richard as king. Although it is believed that the Duke of Buckingham may have considered a bid for the throne himself, he ultimately would connect with Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, and decided to support Henry's claim to the throne himself. In addition to the Duke of Buckingham, it is believed that Henry's mother also communicated with Edward IV's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the princes in the Tower, to which she supported the idea that Henry would be betrothed to her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This would greatly assist Henry were he to become king, as a marriage to the eldest daughter of King Edward IV would potentially bring him allies in the House of York who remained loyal to Edward IV and his son, the deposed Edward V. With Henry's increased prospects of becoming king and rebellions forming in the south of England, partly in his name, Duke Francis of Brittany agreed to assist in an invasion. Ships were provided, and Henry set sail with the intention of linking up with the rebels once landing. But unfortunately for Henry, the rebellions were timed poorly, and soon Richard received word of Buckingham's betrayal. Opposition was quickly crushed, with the Duke of Buckingham being captured and executed in Salisbury. Henry's ships, which had been scattered by bad weather, eventually were forced to return to Normandy, with Henry himself returning to Brittany and learning of Buckingham's defeat. This, of course, was a major setback for Henry, but it would be far from the end of his story. Now, after the rebellions in England had been crushed, Henry found that some of the rebels had escaped to the continent and were waiting to join him in Brittany, adding strength to his cause. This group met at Rennes, and in Rennes, at the cathedral, upon Henry promising to marry Elizabeth of York if he became king, the group of exiles swore homage to him before plans began yet again for another landing in England. But major issues would arise before Henry would be able to attempt another invasion of England. First, Henry's mother Margaret Beaufort was still in England, and unsurprisingly, she was found to be connected to the plots related to her son. She would be attainted, but was treated leniently given the nature of her involvement. This was due to the fact that prior to her involvement in the plots against Richard III, she had married a man named Thomas Stanley, also known as Lord Stanley. Lord Stanley was a previous supporter of Edward IV, and Richard III chose to keep him in his service in order to appease some of his elder brother's Yorkist followers. Therefore, Richard III could not afford to alienate Lord Stanley, as he was needed as an ally. Thus, Henry's mother simply had her lands seized and transferred to her husband. Another potential serious problem was that Queen Elizabeth Woodville, believing that all was lost after the rebellion was crushed, decided on a pragmatic approach to dealing with Richard III. She negotiated with Richard III for her and her daughters to leave sanctuary, and for Richard to find suitable marriages for her daughters. This was agreed to, and if Elizabeth of York was to be married off, this would greatly hurt Henry's position. Queen Elizabeth Woodville also agreed to attempt to convince one of her sons from a prior marriage, who was in exile with Henry at the time, to return to England, as Richard agreed to show him mercy. Her son did attempt to desert Henry, but was convinced to stay the course by Henry's supporters. A parliament in 1484 passed the statute Titulus Regis, which formally declared Richard III's right to the throne and formally bastardized the children of Edward IV, including Henry's intended bride, Elizabeth of York. Events would turn against Henry in Brittany as well around this time. Duke Francis became incapacitated, and his treasurer, Peter Landois, took effective control. After Richard agreed to provide archers for Brittany's defense, it is believed that Landois agreed to hand over Henry. Henry, however, was notified of the treachery and requested permission to enter France, which was granted. Henry was forced to secretly cross the border into France, where he and his party were received with honor. Some of his English supporters were forced to be left at Vannes, but soon Duke Francis II recovered and was outraged by the treatment shown to Henry. The French were only too happy to assist Henry in his endeavors in England, as Richard III had taken a hard stance against them, and the French feared a resurgence of the 100 Years' War, which had ended during King Henry VI's time. Therefore, the French agreed to supply troops and ships for Henry and his allies. However, around this time, Richard III's son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died, as did his queen, Anne, to which it was rumored that Richard had actually poisoned her or aided in her demise, as she had been sick for some time. The death of Richard's only son and heir was devastating, not only to Richard III personally, but dynastically as well. Therefore, it is believed that Richard considered an interesting option, that he would marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York. This would bring him a young wife that could bear children and potentially an heir, while simultaneously devastating Henry's position by eliminating Elizabeth as a potential bride for him. This in the end would not happen, as Richard found there was pushback to this from his supporters. Thus, he publicly denied these claims, or that he had ever considered them. Richard still could marry Elizabeth off, but as it would turn out, he would never get that chance, for Henry would soon launch his bid for the throne. Although Henry was welcomed by the French and treated well, immediate monetary support was not forthcoming. Months went by before it was agreed that the French would help launch an invasion. What was promised, at least initially, was not substantial, as to many, Henry's prospects seemed doubtful, and it is believed that the French saw Henry as simply a pawn to be used to harass the English across the Channel and perhaps limit English support of Brittany. But eventually aid would be given, which included troops, ships, and protections across the Channel. Henry and his exiled allies made up the minority of the force raised, which included many French and Scottish mercenaries. Richard III did make preparations to attempt to prevent Henry's landing, but eventually was forced to withdraw many of his ships and soldiers that were set up to prevent this. Henry set sail for England, and this time the weather cooperated. He was able to make landfall at Milford Haven in Wales via Mill Bay on August 7, 1485. Henry's travels through Wales would be nerve-wracking, as it was not possible to know who could truly be trusted. But in the end, Henry was to meet no opposition in Wales. It should be noted, however, that he also did not gain substantial support as he moved. It is believed that both Henry and Richard wished to engage each other as soon as possible, for fear that each other's ranks would swell, and thus chose to seek each other out. Although Henry seemed to be moving freely through the country, it was clear that he would not be able to succeed if he did not gain significantly more support before engaging Richard's forces, as Richard's forces were believed to have been larger. Everything would depend on the Stanleys, both Henry's stepfather Thomas Stanley and Thomas Stanley's brother William. It is believed that Henry had received promising correspondence with the Stanleys in regard to his kingly aspirations prior to the upcoming inevitable battle, but the Stanleys were notorious fence riders and had built up a reputation for withholding their forces until they were certain who would be victorious. The Stanleys did not openly declare for Henry, and Henry continued his pursuit of Richard III, who had traveled to Leicester. The two forces met south of the town of Market Bosworth. The next day, August 22, 1485, the Battle of Bosworth Field commenced. The battle raged inconclusively for some time until Richard III, wearing his crown, identified Henry on the battlefield and chose to charge him with a select group of forces. Richard III hoped to quickly and conclusively end the battle by killing Henry, and was nearly successful in this, as it has been claimed that Richard killed Henry's standard-bearer and many others around him. However, staunch resistance would prevent Richard from reaching Henry, and at this very crucial time, the Stanleys' forces were committed to Henry. Richard III, refusing to withdraw, stood bravely in battle as he was overwhelmed and struck down. Richard's forces fled the field, leaving Henry the victor in this, the last battle in which an English king would lose his life. Richard's crown was found beneath a thorn bush, retrieved and placed on Henry's head by his stepfather, Lord Stanley, on the battlefield, where he was proclaimed as King Henry VII by his men. The Battle of Bosworth Field would change the direction of the English monarchy forever, simultaneously resulting in the death of the last Plantagenet and Yorkist king and ushering in the first Tudor king. Henry had, quite surprisingly, defeated his opponent and usurped the throne, but he would soon find out that maintaining power would prove far more difficult than attaining it. After the victory at Bosworth, Henry Tudor effectively became King of England. However, one must remember that Henry for many years had been in exile with little if no wealth and had spent little time in England and Wales. Yet now he was expected to take on the full responsibilities of kingship with no experience in government or administration, which would prove to be very difficult indeed. Henry formulated a bodyguard for himself, as there was to be many issues that would arise during Henry's time as king, and he and his government would be forced to think creatively in order to find ways to deal with these issues. The Beaufort lineage, from where Henry drew his claim, had actually been barred from the succession after the Beaufort line had been legitimized, but this was simply overlooked, for Henry was now clearly, after Bosworth, seen as the rightful king. Henry was crowned king on October 30th, 1485. Writs were issued for a parliament to meet in November, and Henry began to distribute honors, titles, and lands to his supporters. This obviously included his mother, but also included his stepfather and his stepfather's brother, the Stanleys. Henry wished to be able to convict Richard III of treason, and thus simply backdated his reign to one day before the Battle of Bosworth. Therefore, Richard III could be considered a traitor, fighting against Henry, who at the time of Bosworth would have been considered the true king. The first parliament opened as planned, and the primary purpose of the parliament was to declare Henry's title, reverse attainders, and impose Henry's own attainders. Richard III was convicted of treason and attainted, while previous supporters of Henry VI were alleviated from their prior penalties. Henry held off initially marrying Elizabeth of York, as he did not want his claim to the throne to be considered as directly depending on her being the heir to the Yorkists. However, eventually the Commons requested that Henry stick to his promises and marry Elizabeth, to which Henry agreed. However, Elizabeth of York had been declared a bastard, along with her vanished brothers, the princes in the Tower, and therefore action needed to be taken to remedy this. The statute that was passed in Richard III's reign declaring this was nullified, and given the scandalous nature of the statute itself, it was decided that many of the words from the statute were to be censored and all copies destroyed. With Henry's potential new bride legitimized, the wedding was able to take place in early 1486, and 7 months later, their first child, a son and heir named Arthur, was born at Winchester. In the new baby prince flowed the blood of both Lancaster and York, and with this, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were combined into a new symbol, a white and red rose, known today as the Tudor rose. Henry's claim was a weak one indeed, and in the process of legitimizing his wife Elizabeth of York, he also reinstated the legitimacy of her brothers, the princes in the Tower. Defenders of Richard III in recent times have argued that the boys were still living at this time, and that Henry had the boys killed, as if they lived, they would be the rightful heirs to the throne, not him. However, it is most likely true that Henry did not know what happened to the princes, or whether they were alive or dead, and due to this, Henry avoided initially claiming outright that Richard III had had the boys killed. As we will soon see, the ghosts of the princes in the Tower would haunt Henry's reign for many years. Additionally, there were still members of the House of York alive that could be seen as threats to his kingship, specifically the nephews of Edward IV and Richard III. On his way to London, after the victory at Bosworth, Henry had sent one of his men to take into custody Edward, Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III, through their executed brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Edward, Earl of Warwick, was thought to be possibly intellectually disabled and simple, and his claims were technically not valid due to his father's attainder. However, Henry was taking no chances, and so decided to lodge Edward, Earl of Warwick in the Tower of London. Another of Edward IV and Richard III's nephews was a man named John de la Pole, 1st Earl of Lincoln, son of their sister Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk. John de la Pole would be involved in one of the first major rebellions in Henry's reign, which will be discussed shortly. Edward IV and Richard III's father, Richard, Duke of York, in the past had been designated as lieutenant in Ireland and had actually used Ireland as a refuge from Henry VI and his government during the Wars of the Roses. During his time as lieutenant, it is said that Richard, Duke of York, was successful in converting much of Ireland to the Yorkist cause. In the absence of a lieutenant, the Irish lords had become accustomed to ruling in their own right, although technically subordinate to whoever the king's lieutenant was. Thus, Ireland would be where the first of several impostors would appear, who would be intent on claiming to be the rightful king of England through different Yorkist claimants. The first was a young boy who claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, who, as touched on previously, was in Henry's custody and locked in the Tower of London. This young boy, named Lambert Simnel, had been trained for the role and began to gain much support. What made this situation concerning is that John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, had fled to Flanders and was supported by Edward IV and Richard III's sister, Margaret of Burgundy. In May 1487, John de la Pole landed in Ireland with German mercenaries, and shortly thereafter, the young impostor, with support from de la Pole, was crowned as Edward VI in Dublin. It was clear that there was an attempt to do to Henry what Henry had done to Richard III at Bosworth. Henry paraded the real Earl of Warwick to the people to prove that the young boy claiming to be him was indeed an impostor. The rebels landed in England, and in June, Henry's forces met them at the town of East Stoke. The resulting Battle of Stoke Field was a victory for Henry, with John de la Pole along with other leading conspirators being slain, and the young impostor, Lambert Simnel, himself being captured. This battle, although not as influential as the Battle of Bosworth, is considered by many today to be the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, though this would be far from the end of Henry's troubles. Lambert Simnel was shown leniency and was found a position in the royal kitchens as a spit turner before eventually becoming a royal falconer. Although Henry was successful in defending his throne, it was nonetheless concerning, as it came only 2 years after Henry's ascension. This, of course, would add additional anxiety to the already anxious Henry. Henry attainted those involved in the uprising at his next parliament and did his best to bring the Irish lords to heel by attaining a papal bull in January 1488, which excommunicated anyone in Ireland involved in the coronation of the impostor, and by finally sending one of his counselors in person to Ireland, who had the powers to pardon those who would submit. Henry's influence on Ireland remained limited, but it at least reminded the Irish lords of Henry's presence. However, it would be only a few years later, in 1491, that another impostor would present themselves. This impostor, named Perkin Warbeck, would be different in that instead of claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, he would claim to be the younger of the princes in the Tower, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. However, it has been said that initially he may have been presented as another Earl of Warwick, or even as one of Richard III's bastard sons before settling on Richard of Shrewsbury. This was problematic for Henry, as unlike the last impostor, Henry could not present the real Richard of Shrewsbury to the people, as it is believed that no one at the time knew what happened to the princes in the Tower. Warbeck first appeared in Cork in Ireland, but much of what brought him to the limelight remains unknown. It has been said that Margaret of Burgundy, discussed previously, played a role, and that the French were involved as well. It should also be noted that in 1491, Henry would have a second son, also named Henry, and although Prince Arthur remained the focus of Henry's dynastic ambitions, young Prince Henry would end up soon playing a major role in the English monarchy and will be something discussed at a later time. Warbeck's reception in Ireland was unenthusiastic, and it became clear that Warbeck would not secure the same support that Simnel had previously. Thus, by 1492, he began to seek acceptance elsewhere. He was welcomed by the French king, Charles VIII, who received him with honor at court. But soon Henry's defense of Brittany in a Franco-Breton dispute via an invasion led to negotiations, and in November 1492, the Treaty of Etaples was agreed to, which saw Charles VIII agreeing to withdraw his support for Warbeck, among other things. Warbeck traveled to Margaret of Burgundy, who accepted Warbeck as her nephew, i.e. Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower. The Burgundian leadership at the time was on bad terms with Henry, and were all too eager to support Warbeck's claims. Henry needed a way to take attention away from Warbeck and from who he was claiming to be, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Thus, Henry chose to install his younger son, Prince Henry, 3 years old at the time, as Duke of York in November 1494. Henry was also keen to track down the English support for Warbeck and tirelessly pursued this via monitoring and spies, something that Henry's reign would become notorious for. To Henry's disbelief, he found that support traced all the way back to the heart of his household. His chamberlain, Sir William Stanley, brother to Henry's stepfather, Lord Stanley, was found to be complicit in the plots. Sir William Stanley had been physically involved in the attack at Bosworth that swung the tide in the battle to Henry's side. But it mattered not. Stanley was tried and beheaded in 1495. This would be one of the first instances of betrayal that would lead to the suspicion and control Henry would eventually seek during his time as king, and is something that will be discussed at a later time. Warbeck would attempt to land at Deal off the Kentish coast, but his forces were quickly annihilated, with Warbeck himself abandoning his men and fleeing to Ireland. But Ireland yielded no prospects for the impostor. Thus, Warbeck traveled to Scotland and was received by King James IV in 1495. England and Scotland had recently seen hostilities arise during the reign of Edward IV, and although it is believed that the Scots may have assisted Henry at Bosworth, tensions still ran high between the two kingdoms. Warbeck's presence in Scotland, and indeed his very existence, was of great concern to Henry, as Warbeck's support impeded Henry's attempts to secure a marriage for his son and heir, Arthur, to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon, as her parents were hesitant to marry their daughter off to an English prince if other claimants to the throne remained. Henry attempted to negotiate with Scotland, but this was not to be, and in September, Warbeck's invasion of England commenced. It would prove to be an utter failure, as it ended after 6 days with no support given south of the Scottish border. Additionally, the devastation to the countryside shocked Warbeck, who retreated back to Scotland. Henry, still concerned, raised massive funds for an offensive in the north through taxation, which brought about much resentment throughout the realm. James IV eventually cut ties with Warbeck, and a peace would be agreed to, which would eventually see James IV marrying Henry's daughter, Princess Margaret Tudor. However, in 1497, a rebellion took place in Cornwall, known as the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. The funds raised by taxation for confronting Warbeck and his supporters in the north were now directed towards this rebellion. The rebels pushed their way all the way to the outskirts of London, forcing Henry's queen, mother, and children to flee to the Tower. Eventually, however, the rebels were defeated at the Battle of Blackheath, also known as the Battle of Deptford Bridge. Warbeck, hoping to piggyback off the resentment felt in Cornwall after the rebellion, landed in the southwest with hopes of gathering support. Nothing was to come of this. Warbeck's forces were scattered, with Warbeck himself fleeing and eventually being captured. He confessed his true identity and was actually treated reasonably well by Henry, initially being brought to court. However, this was simply so that Henry could display Warbeck and have him around for people to marvel at. Soon, Warbeck would attempt to escape in 1498, but was recaptured and lodged in the Tower of London. Soon after, a plot allegedly was discovered, in which it was believed that Warbeck and Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was still in captivity at the Tower, were planning a joint escape. This would be the end of both Warbeck and the Earl of Warwick. Both were executed in 1499, with Warbeck being executed publicly and Edward, Earl of Warwick, being executed privately due to his noble status. 1499 would also see another, less well-known plot that would see a third pretender, known as Ralph Wilford, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick. This was quickly handled, with Wilford being captured and executed in the same year. With the eliminations of contenders and imposters to the throne, in 1501, Henry was able to secure the marriage of the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon to his son Arthur. The occasion was a joyous and incredibly grand experience, and Catherine would end up meeting her brother-in-law, the young Prince Henry, at this time. Little did she know how intertwined and unfortunate their futures would be. After the wedding, Henry surely felt a sense of security after dealing with rebellion, imposters, and tense international relations. Unfortunately for Henry, his sense of security would be shattered only a short time later. Arthur and Catherine would leave for Arthur's distant seat at Ludlow, and shortly thereafter, in April 1502, Arthur would die from the sweating sickness that had been going around in England. Henry was devastated and sent for his wife, Elizabeth. Although the royal couple had been brought together by their bloodlines and by politics, it is believed that by the time Arthur had died, Henry and Elizabeth had grown into a close relationship with one another. Elizabeth comforted Henry, reminding him that he still had a son and that he still had her, and they could still produce more children. Soon, Elizabeth would be the one requiring comfort, as she too came to terms with her son's premature death. Of course, Henry and Elizabeth's sorrows were surely a sign of parental anguish, but additional gravity was added to this loss due to the dynastic importance Prince Arthur played. The future of the Tudor dynasty now hung by a thread with the young 10-year-old Prince Henry. Henry's devastation would not end with the death of Arthur, unfortunately. Queen Elizabeth became pregnant again, and in February 1503, she gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, who would die shortly thereafter. Unfortunately, Elizabeth herself would develop a fever, fall in and out of consciousness, and eventually pass away from the labor. Henry again was devastated. He retreated to Richmond, where he disappeared into the innermost chambers. The tide had changed dramatically for Henry in just a few short years, and with this, a new, much more sinister version of Henry was to be revealed. Although Henry had dealt with 3 imposters decisively, claimants to the throne still existed throughout the realm. The most troublesome was to be the brother of the killed John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. His name was Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and after his brother's death at Stoke, he had served Henry, being involved in the invasion of France as well as defending against the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. It is believed that de la Pole gained little from this, as Henry was leery of his Yorkist blood. Additionally, he had been involved in an altercation resulting in a murder, to which he was forced to beg for a pardon. This was perceived by de la Pole as a slight to his honor, to which he therefore attempted to exile in 1499, but was convinced to return to England. In the end, however, de la Pole was unable to shake the suspicion, and eventually he fled again to the continent, looking for support from foreign leaders, to Henry's dismay and horror. Henry had finally dealt with the many pretenders and claimants to the throne, and had hoped to find a smoother path moving forward. With de la Pole fleeing to the continent, Henry knew that trouble would remain for him, and the loss of Prince Arthur only added potential strength to de la Pole's position. It should be noted that one of the men who was implicated in de la Pole's plot was a man named Sir James Tyrrell. Tyrrell had been a loyal servant to Richard III, but had remained in Henry's good grace up until his involvement in the de la Pole plot. He would be executed for his role in this. However, it has been alleged that prior to his execution, he confessed that he had been hired by Richard III to kill the princes in the Tower. This story was put out many years after the prince's disappearance, and in all likelihood, its intention was to lay to rest the idea that one or both of the princes in the Tower still lived. Of course, as are many topics related to the princes in the Tower, this confession has been doubted by many. Henry continued to find that disloyalty plagued his household, and this would begin to make Henry ever suspicious of those around him. To add to his anxiety, Henry had a bout of serious sickness in 1499 near the end of the Perkin-Warbeck events, something that would reemerge as the cold seasons came and went through the coming years. As Henry recovered from his illness, and given the nature of his losses and potential problems abroad, it was said that something changed in Henry, that he became detached from those around him and became fiercely dedicated to controlling his kingdom and subjects within. He had much business to tend to with his young son, Prince Henry, who up to that point had taken a back seat to his elder brother Arthur. Prince Henry now became the face of the future of the dynasty, and although he was already showing himself to be quite different from his brother Arthur, he was still young and vulnerable without his father. Thus, Henry's sickness was all the more serious and was kept under wraps, for if Henry could not establish his young son as the rightful, proper, and capable heir before he died, the chances that the prince would retain his subjects' loyalty were slim, as there still remained men with royal claims within England and abroad. Henry agreed to the betrothal of Prince Henry and the deceased Prince Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, although the marriage would not take place during Henry's lifetime, due in part to Catherine's unpaid dowry and in part to Henry wanting to keep marriage options open for his young son. Prince Henry, unlike his elder brother Arthur, was kept close in Henry's own household, for Henry would take a keen interest in his only remaining son's safety as time went on. The prince began to dress in royal colors and was designated as the Prince of Wales 2 years after Arthur's death. He began developing a preference for big occasion, and an emphasis was put on his military training, although his every move was tightly controlled. Henry was making sure that Prince Henry was to be seen as the future of the English monarchy, but it would take time for this to happen. While young Henry grew as a prince, Henry himself continued to grow his new form of control over his subjects. A toxic culture began to emerge under Henry's suspicions. It was said that early in Henry's reign, he was initially skeptical of anyone who brought forth accusations of disloyalty about those within his close ranks. However, he unfortunately was stunned to find that some of the accusations were correct and that he truly had been betrayed by some of those he had trusted most. Due to these betrayals that Henry had uncovered throughout the years within his household, his suspicion was ever growing. This, mixed with the losses that he incurred, discussed previously, made Henry begin to formulate a system of control that would seize power from anyone else in the realm that may hold it. This would bring him ever closer to an absolute monarchy, something that was seen in France, in which the king's will was paramount. The system would also yield massive financial benefits for the crown, at the cost of not only his noblemen, but eventually the lower classes and clergy as well. One of the king's closest administrators was a man named Reginald Bray, who had known Henry since childhood and was crucial in the development of this new system. Bray played a major part in the development of something known today as the Council Learned in Law, sometimes simply referred to as the Council Learned. This group was essentially an arbitrary group of council members who specialized in law and/or administration and who were experts in finding ways to interpret or twist laws in favor of Henry. It was an elusive group with no fixed set of members, and it was never legally constituted. This group would partake in shadowy proceedings in which Henry's rights as king were identified and exploited through loopholes or technicalities in the law. Subjects would be summoned to defend themselves against unspecified accusations and would find themselves involved in a burdensome and unfair process that invoked fear and rage in many a mind. The Council Learned was not a recognized court of law, but yet it often bypassed common law courts and put people at the mercy of the king's ultimate authority. Those unfortunate enough to become embroiled in this process would be forced into bonds, debts to the crown, and fines in order to clear their name, or in some cases, secure their freedom. The accusations were oftentimes questionable or outright false, and many would find themselves tricked into falling into the trap by being coerced or prodded into saying incriminating things. Reginald Bray had had a special relationship with Henry and was said to have been able to speak freely or even contradict Henry sometimes. However, in 1503, Bray died and was replaced by a lower-born man named Edmund Dudley. Dudley was extremely well versed in the intricacies of law and was a perfect replacement for the deceased Bray. However, Dudley was different than Bray in that Dudley was a yes man who would not contradict Henry, but would do whatever Henry requested or required of him by any means necessary. Dudley's job was to seek out and uncover every way in which the law could be tweaked or interpreted to benefit Henry financially, and although he would work beside the Council Learned in Law, Dudley would take special precedence in Henry's mind. Henry and Dudley began meeting directly, reviewing Dudley's account book together, with Henry eventually beginning to sign each page of the book himself. Eventually, over time, this group of law experts would wreak havoc on the English people, and a great deal of detestation began to emerge for Henry and his merciless counselors. For the financial penalties that were being enforced on the people may have been legal on technicalities, but they certainly were not just. Despite Henry's growing power and influence in England, he still had a very serious issue in Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who had not yet been captured or extradited. One man keen to play Suffolk against Henry was the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Fair, who along with the widowed Margaret of Burgundy were eager to use the previous pretenders and de la Pole to their advantage. Henry supplied massive amounts of money to Philip in the form of loans, which Philip intended to use for a voyage to Castile, to which he had a claim to the throne. Despite Henry's efforts to have Edmund de la Pole extradited to England, Philip found excuses for why this was not possible. But in 1506, Henry's luck changed. Philip set sail for Spain, traveling through the English Channel, when storms wrecked him off the English coast. He was welcomed with honor as a guest/prisoner, and one of the conditions for Philip's release was that Edmund de la Pole would be sent to England immediately. Thus, a treaty was agreed to, and Edmund de la Pole was arrested and transferred back to England, where he was put in the Tower of London, never to leave again. With that, Henry had one less issue to worry about, but his health was deteriorating, and he still had unfinished business in making sure that his son, Prince Henry, would have a smooth transition to the throne. Previously, with Edmund de la Pole as a fugitive, there was still a degree of reservation with regards to his counselors financially attacking the political elite, as in de la Pole, there was a potential rallying point against Henry's unjust counselors. Although Edmund de la Pole still had a younger brother named Richard at large on the continent, he didn't seem to pose as much of a threat as Edmund did. Therefore, after Edmund de la Pole's capture, Henry let loose his counselors on the members of the political elite. Many were forced into bonds, forced to purchase pardons, and the debts incurred many times exceeded anything that those accused could ever hope to pay off. Many were forced into perpetual debt to the crown, which would be inherited by their children and grandchildren. Although many times recognizances were employed, essentially a suspension of the fines, they could be triggered at any time should someone fall out of line. This not only brought in an immense amount of money, but also redirected any loyalties that had existed elsewhere directly to the crown. Furthermore, Henry's counselors were now not just targeting those who had suspect loyalty or those who could be seen as a threat to Henry's kingship. Instead, the counselors looked to go after anyone they could possibly get. As the lawyer counselors continued to search for ways to twist the law, they continued to find forgotten laws, hundreds of years old, that were reactivated so as to be used to Henry's benefit. One of the men who held primary responsibility for this was Edmund Dudley, who had become Henry's go-to man. Since he had taken over, the number of people in debt to the crown had grown exponentially, and Henry gave him free rein to do as he pleased in his name. Due process was no longer a reality, and a network of informers began to grow, known then as promoters. These promoters would be the ears and eyes of the counselors and would often get a cut of the proceeds from those convicted. In early 1507, Henry fell seriously ill again, to the point that many thought he would not survive. Being close to death, Henry laxed the financial constraints that he had been using to plague the people and released many of those imprisoned. But soon Henry began to recover, and with his recovery came his counselors again re-emerging to continue their practices. Fear and vicious resentment began to grow in regards to the counsel learned in law, the promoters that they utilized, and Henry, who was no doubt the true driver behind these actions. Prince Henry continued to be sheltered, but was now at 16 years old in 1507, emerging as a transformed, eager prince. He was an athletic and attractive young man, but seemed to show many personality traits of his Yorkist side of the family. He was quite informal, easily accessible, and spontaneous, in stark contrast to his father's calm, calculated, and reclusive personality. With Henry continuing to fade away from public view, in part due to his sickness, he was all too happy to thrust his son into the limelight, although the prince had little if no power. Henry's sickness re-emerged again in early 1508, to the point that he was unable to eat and had difficulty breathing. His body grew ever more sickly, and he preferred not to be seen. His counselors pushed on continuing their practices harder than they ever had before, as it is believed that Henry feared that his sickness might give signs of weakness. Prince Henry was becoming restless, as princes tend to do in those situations. It had become clear that although Henry had done a good job in presenting Prince Henry as the future of his dynasty, the prince would be a very different king than his father was. The undermining of the law that Henry had pursued had brought forth a different kind of rule, one of near absolute royal control, and this is something that future Tudor monarchs would further in the future. In the early cold months of 1509, Henry's sickness set on for a final time. In February, he moved to Richmond, and it was clear that he would not emerge again. By March, he was near death, struggling to breathe and in intense pain, but he continued to fight on. He drew up his will, and finally, on April 21st, 1509, at 11 p.m., King Henry VII died at the age of 52, surrounded by a large group of attendants. Prince Henry was notified, and soon changes began to be implemented by the new young king. Pardons were issued, prisons were freed, and most importantly, the unjust system of financial ruin of subjects was to be abandoned. Edmund Dudley, the worst of counselors with regards to the financial system put in place, was arrested and would eventually be executed on trumped-up charges of treason, although it was clear to everyone that this was due to the role that he played in the previous year's financial subjugations. Henry's body was washed, embalmed, and laid in state before processing to his funeral. He was laid next to his wife, Elizabeth of York, in Westminster Abbey. This tomb can still be seen at Westminster Abbey to this day. Henry's time as King of England, and indeed his entire life, was a difficult one. From his youth during the Wars of the Roses and eventual exile on the continent, to his impostor and rebellion-plagued reign, it is not hard to see why Henry was an anxious and reserved king. His claim to the throne was weak, his victory at Bosworth surprising, and his experience as a political leader minimal. Add to this the then recent memory of the Wars of the Roses, with King Henry VI and King Edward V both being examples of what could befall a king with disputed claims. One can begin to understand Henry's mindset and the suspicions he must have felt about the potential for similar events to take place against him. His kingship was arguably never safe, and the events that took place throughout his time as king, with the imposters and rebellions, proved this to be true. Many have pointed to Henry's financial subjugation of his people as proof that he was simply a greedy king who cared first and foremost about filling his pockets to the great detriment of the realm. But given the nature of Henry's entire life and the ruthless possibilities that confronted Henry both in England and abroad, his financial grip on his kingdom was just as much about control and maintaining power as it was about greed and avarice. Henry, although an interesting king in his own right, is oftentimes overshadowed by his predecessor, the hated and debated King Richard III, and by his successor and son, the infamous Henry VIII, perhaps the most famous king in the history of the English monarchy. But Henry remains as an important king in history, as the founder of the Tudor dynasty, the destroyer of the Plantagenet dynasty, and as the forefather to the future interesting generations of English kings and queens. For this, Henry's role in morphing the English monarchy should not be understated.